Going to get started. My name is Daniela Bleichmer. I am a professor of art history and history at USC and the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities. Welcome to today's book chat, where we will be discussing Christopher Hepburn's new book, Defining Waka Musically, Songs of Male Love in Premodern Japan, out in 2023. I would like to invite everyone who is able to turn on their camera to please do so. It is much more collegial and fun to see people's faces when possible. So don't be shy. Please turn on your camera to accompany Christopher in this conversation. Today's book chat is co-organized by the USC East Asian Studies Center and the USC Center for the Premodern World. And today we will be hearing from Christopher Hepburn, the author, who is a postdoctoral scholar and teaching fellow in the Van Hannick Department of History and the East Asian and Music Libraries at USC. He will be in conversation with Jennifer Guest, who is Associate Professor of Japanese at the University of Oxford, and with Stacey Jocoy, who is a music reference specialist in the music division at the Library of Congress. And today's conversation will be moderated by Kerim Yasar, who is Associate Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures at USC. So welcome, Christopher. Many congratulations on your book, and please tell us about it.
Yes, thank you so much, Daniela. Firstly, I would like to thank USC and the Levan Institute for the Humanities, the East Asian Studies Center, and the Center for the Premodern World for co-sponsoring this event. Additionally, I would like to thank the interlocutors, Professors Guest, Jocoy, and Yasar, and all guests for taking their time out of their very busy days to join me on such a favorable occasion. Additionally, I'd like to thank William Deverell, Dean of Social Sciences, who is my faculty mentor, for all of his encouragement. Your presence here is truly most welcome. To introduce the book briefly, my initial research question, at least at the start of this study, was, what are waka? And the most common definition I found at the time was one wherein waka is often situated in one way or another as a literary form. This works for literary studies, which is where waka are usually encountered, but for musicologists, it's a definition that is difficult to accept. And this kind of words for the sake of words style of formalist treatment isn't anything new for musicologists, especially if we consider how ardently scholars of, say, early modern British ballads have gone head to head over whether the music traditionally accompanying such texts even matters. And the reasons why sound should matter in terms of waka are variously scattered across the pages of my modest book. And yet the most obvious reason was not invented by me, but by the pre-modern Japanese. This statement is especially true in recognizing what we know of waka and how they were used, which was in a very real way as intersubjective phenomenologies of sound. However, very few arguments have been made for the phenomenology of sound when it comes to the study of waka in the West. So in my book, I try to make the case for viewing waka not simply as words on a page, which is how waka tend to be treated in the West, but more so as complex synesthetic objects that relied on the mutual stimulation of multiple senses, including calligraphic ones, to create their overall effect and impact on the human body. At the same time, I try not to privilege the moment of sound's making or hearing, which phenomenologies of sound tend to do, but also sound's design. In other words, the intersubjective movement and its meaning between what I ended up referring to as the manifested composer, performer, listener. In the end, and I guess for better or worse, the outcome was an extended thought piece that I ended up calling Defining Waka Musically. And I look forward to discussing more about such things in today's chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. So now I would like to turn to our guest interlocutors, Jennifer Guest from Oxford and Stacey Jocoy from the Library of Congress. Generally, we do this in alphabetical order, so I would invite Professor Guest to make the first comment or question.
All right, thanks very much. And thank you, Christopher, for giving us a good intro to go on with and build this discussion. So I think there's a suggestion in chat that maybe we could, or that, I guess it's just to me that, it might be good to sort of say a bit in this first question about what Waka is. And so actually, I mean, in a sense, maybe this makes a good first question to actually just expand on that together, because I think, Christopher, you might have ideas about how to phrase that and how to, sort of expand that definition that may overlap with mine, but might also incorporate some different ideas. So, I mean, it's actually, I very much liked how you started your intro, because I remember attending some Waka workshops as a graduate student, in which many of us, would gather afterwards and sort of semi-jokingly say, well, actually, what is Waka? Realize that this was not a straightforward question. So, I mean, I think, a very simple, but maybe, debatable definition could be something like it's a form of pre-modern Japanese poetry. Perhaps pre-modern Japanese court poetry that as a non-ironclad norm has 31 syllables, or more properly mora, and that plays a very central role in a wide variety of pre-modern Japanese cultural contexts. It's known for its incorporation into visual art, into the lived environment through its inscription on screens, and into the kind of court spaces. It's given rise to a very rich manuscript tradition and interacts with images in various sorts of visual arts in interesting ways. And as your book so interestingly explores, I mean, it was also a performance form in a variety of ways throughout Japanese history, and is often talked about by pre-modern writers, although, often in frustratingly unclear to us terms, as, a sung or recited form in which sound qualities are immensely important. So I don't know, as a good first question, maybe would you like to kind of build on that in any ways, or indeed argue with any of it?
Yes, it's a very interesting term in and of itself. We can look at it simply linguistically and see that, it's wa and ka, it's Japanese songs. But what then does songs mean? Of course, song is culturally defined, and even in the West, as far back as we can go, poems and songs share some type of intermediality. And in the case of pre-modern Japan, somewhere along the line, the word waka and the word tanka somehow became superimposed, where waka meant something that was 5-7-5-7-7. And prior to that, waka, it seems, incorporated all different types of poetic forms. For me, that was incredibly frustrating, especially when I set out to look at waka as something of a sound art or a musical artifact. And I was fortunate that a lot of work had already been done, not on waka, but on, say, French ballads in the past, or English ballads, to pull them back into the realm of music as a science and also as a philosophy, that I had a basis by which I could look at waka through the same kind of lens. The definition that I came up with, in addition to how, say, the Japanese dictionaries have defined it since the modern inception of the Japanese dictionary, but also back to how the Portuguese have defined it in their own dictionaries, as a form of music and poetry, intonation and speech combining to form an effective expressive synthesis. And that was the definition I eventually settled on. But as you discovered in my book, it's not a definition that everyone who has worked on waka in the past has agreed on. And I try to tease out why that disagreement existed, at least at the time that these scholars were writing about Waka.
Professor Jocoy, would you like to ask a question at this point or follow up on Christopher's answer?
Certainly. Hi there. Well, when Christopher started the project that was the predecessor to the book, the initial question was, what is sound or music or musicality doing in Waka? How is it informing it, right? And but just to kind of follow up on part of the last answer. You mentioned, of course, pre-modern discussions of European music that went particularly to various texts, including ballads, right? So, so since the emergence of sound studies in the 1970s, there's been a rather intricate exploration, I'd say, weaving through various disciplines and through its attempt to destabilize the act of beholding in favor of the act of hearing. It has shed light on the profound impact of sonic experiences in human societies. So within this larger discussion that's out there, your study seems to have a very unique thread contributing to the non-Western understanding of sound and its cultural significance. So you are, I guess, destabilizing the act of seeing, like the calligraphic image on the page. And so why go that extra step? What has, your superimposition then demonstrated beyond what Waka scholars who primarily focus on the image have done?
Right. Thank you for that question. And thank you, Jenny, also for your question. So in my book, I try to superimpose two dichotomies. One is what the eye can see and what the ear can hear. And I kind of put them together in terms of what the ear can see and what the eye can hear. And what I end up referring to and borrowing from Bruce Benson is called the seeing ear and the hearing eye. In short, sound studies does not always seek to acknowledge the interconnectedness of sound with the human sensorium. This approach really doesn't work for Waka since it relies on mutual stimulation of multiple senses to convey its meaning. So in acknowledging this interconnectedness, I sought to bridge two cultural perspectives on sound. That is, by integrating this idea of the seeing ear and the hearing eye, it's possible to transcend the limitations of Western-centric viewpoints towards a revelation of how diverse cultures perceive and interpret sound. From my perspective, at least, this superimposition allows us to more clearly glimpse at the richness and complexities of sound's role in shaping non-Western cultural identities and societal dynamics beyond the conventional dichotomies that we see in different art forms.
So to follow up then, again, your book goes into this larger question of how Japanese sound studies differ, but of course, we know that in several different pre-modern cultural contexts, there is a kind of sympathy like that going on, where the visual, the oral intermix, right? And so, of course, this is particularly important because Waka studies in the past have focused more on the visuality. Yes? Right. So I'll just stop right there. Move on to.
At this point, because this is a, this section of the talk is intended for our guests to have more of a freewheeling conversation with the speaker. I would invite both of our guests to, just ask questions freely, interrupt one another, and make it a little bit more freewheeling. So I'm just going to back out a little bit. If nobody has anything to say, then I'll come right back in, because I also have some thoughts and questions, but I was going to save those until later. But please, let's, one thing I might say, just to kind of, I don't know, perhaps throw, detonate a grenade in the middle of this whole thing, is I wanted to ask Christopher about his feeling of entering this field, perhaps as something of an outsider, coming at it from the perspective of musicology, rather than from the usual background that people who approach Waka have, which is, in Japanese literary studies, and what it means to be, in a sense, a kind of, and I don't use these as terms of abuse, because I think they apply to myself as well, but as someone who's something of an interloper, or something of a trespasser across these disciplinary boundaries. And if you could tell us a little bit about, the challenges of doing that, to sort of enter into a field that, the established parties may feel is not your own, and they may be wondering what you're doing there.
Yeah, it has been challenging, especially since the field of Japan studies is very tight-knit, I guess. And I remember,
and very small too.
Yes.
It's very
Yes.
small. Everybody knows each other.
Yes.
And so if they don't know you,
like, who is this dude? It's even smaller when we reduce it down to pre-modern Japan studies. And I remember when I was giving my paper at AAS, though some in the field of Japan studies were very welcoming and very open to this idea that waka could be seen as a musical artifact, some approached me saying, well, there's no notation, or how are you going to build your time machine so you can go back in time and see how it actually sounded? And those were very frustrating comments, and I understood them, because in musicology we've experienced that in other cultural artifacts, but short of Wellesian proportions, I mean, there's no way to build the time machine. And the point of my study and in my work isn't to reconstruct as much as it is to reimagine. And it worked particularly well for my study, because I'm trying to get at how pre-modern Japanese song poets felt when they were composing their waka, not so much how it might have sounded. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions in the work that musicologists do. And even in my book, I point to some of the reasons why, and musicologists are also guilty for some of those misconceptions. But one of the biggest ones I saw was that in order for it to be some kind of, I don't know, legitimate work, you had to be looking at like the reconstruction of sound instead of how sound might have worked to generate meaning, and meaning in terms of, at least my book, like emotions, realities of desire, those kinds of things.
But you did do a little bit of reconstruction in the book, right? Could you tell everybody a little bit about that, about how you did try to create a kind of approximation of how it might have sort of sounded in order to give the reader a sense of the contours of recitation, and because it was very, I mean, that was, for me, that was a very interesting part of the book. And while it would be a stretch to say that it's a real reconstruction of how it would sound in Heian, Japan, I think it's still an interesting approach, and maybe one that other people might gain some inspiration from, or even think of ways to refine in different ways.
Yeah, so part of my goal was to take two of the most important aspects of music, and I would say poetry, is pitch and temporality, and line them up with what's happening on the page so that, and this is a very Susan McClary way of doing things, that we get an idea of tension and release. So when we're talking about the moon and the pitch goes very, very high, that makes sense. And when we're talking about the grave and the pitch goes very, very low, that also makes sense in terms of spatialness, spatiality. And when they differ, when they don't follow those or deviate from those patterns, it means something. And so in order for me to, well, I mean, have a musical analysis, it was necessary for me to figure out a way to visualize pitch as it moved across time. And as I say in my book, I could have stuck with the standard Tokyo dialect when I was recording voices, but I really didn't want to do that because I wanted to work with a subset or a set dialect that offered more musical opportunity. And that was, of course, the Kansai dialect. And I relied on the Kansai dialect and native Kansai speakers, Kansai Ben speakers, to map these pitches as they moved across time. Now, whether Waka was actually sung that way, I don't know, probably not. But it did provide a way to visualize pitch as it moved across time in a very, I would say, unique way. I don't know anybody else who may have done it like this. And it provided me with the information I needed to generate meaning.
Could I maybe jump in on that?
Mm-hmm.
I have something I'm very curious to ask you that I think follows on from that point, and that I think comes out of the fact that for me, you know, I don't have the background in musicology, so you know, it's very interesting to sort of try and think of things from that different perspective and to try and pick out what I might be missing, you know, in that background. So I'm actually, you know, I'm sort of excited by that. I think I was wondering whether in these sort of visualized sonic contours, you could say a bit more about. So, I mean, this is a speaker of Osaka dialect who is speaking, right? You didn't give her any particular performance cues or ask her to sing or chant it, and you actually do have a discussion of the fact that you are well aware of and kind of, you know, spoke to somebody who. Or maybe multiple people who are practitioners of a kind of modern descendant of some sort of historical poem chanting tradition,
Kigin.
but you sort of decided to not go that route.
Right.
So could you talk a bit more about that process? And that also taps into one of my questions as a non-musicologist. But I think there's this important kind of, for me, I wonder whether there is a distinction between sound and musicality in certain parts of your argument, and if so, how you're conceiving of that? Or would you say that actually sound patterns that are expressing something or that are emotive do also have musicality? Like, am I wrong to think there might be a distinction? And so putting these things together, I wonder whether you think like the images or these melodyne sonic contours would have been very different if the speaker had been actually chanting or singing. Or do you think you would have ended up with quite similar patterns? And is that interesting or not? I'm just basically curious to hear more of your thoughts about this interesting technique.
Give me 3 seconds to write down your question.
Yeah, sorry, I hit you with like
no, it's okay.
questions at once.
So the distinction between the Shigin style or the Chinese style of chanting waka and recording the voice, I had reached out to someone at the Shigin Institute in Kyoto or Tokyo, I can't remember what it was, and I had asked them to record a sample for me of a waka that I just sent out of the blue with zero context. And it was characterized by that very typical rising tone to start it, then the very flat tone, da 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 da, and then the falling tone to close the cadence. And that's not what I was looking for, because it didn't give me much information to work with. Only at the beginning and the end of the phrase. And because I know that Japanese is a pitch accent language, my original guess was, well, let me record someone speaking these waka without any pre-context, and see what those pitches look like. And I was fortunate that of the people I asked to record them, at least in this Kansai/Osaka dialect, the pitches lined up really well between each other. And it didn't matter if it was a woman or a man. Of course, the range of the male voice was much smaller than the female voice, but you could still expand it and see that the pitches were close enough that you could that there's, I mean, similarity. And so at least for my study, that provided me with the kind of information I needed to line these pitches up with the words or the syllables, and make, I guess, this semiotic interpretation. And then the second one was, do I think there is a distinction between sound and musicality? For instance, if one is spoken versus one is chanted.
Or sung, or I don't know, performed in various ways.
Well, in the case of the Kigin, yes. I mean, the way that style is chanted, it was totally different than the way the pitches showed up when they were spoken. And that's a very purposeful way of singing, way of chanting, that kind of strives for a sense of authenticity, although this particular style of singing is, as the director of that institute suggested, a relatively reconstructed style, modern reconstruction. I don't know if I can say that sound is in and of itself inherently imbued with emotion until we imbue it, and that's the difference between sound and musicality, that we somehow imbue sound with feeling and embody the sound in some way that it has meaning to us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Following up on that, well, you had mentioned the seeing ear and the hearing eye, and so I was thinking about that superimposition. In other cultural contexts, we don't usually think so much about. Well, you in your book, you talk about this idea of the composer, the performer, and the listener, right? And so maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on how this seeing ear, hearing eye challenges those more traditional roles.
Yeah, so I mean, it's even hard for us to say it, seeing ear and hearing eye. We kind of, I mean, at least for me at the beginning, jumble over my words. So even in that sense, it challenges us. In the book, I argue for a reevaluation of waka beyond just mere words on a page, kind of urging a recognition of their status as these complex synesthetic objects. This challenges the prevalent Western perspective that often overlooks the sensorial richness that is inherent in Waka, at least that I argue is inherent in Waka. And this includes its calligraphic elements. And this sensorial richness is crucial to its impact on the human body. The approach that I take extends beyond the conventional phenomenological focus on the moment of sound's creation or reception. Instead, I try to propose the concept of sound's design, emphasizing this interplay among, as you said, the composer, the performer, and the listener as a single unit. And I do this by departing from the dichotomy between composition and improvisation. And I contend that both processes contribute to a composition's existence. To that end, the pre-modern Japanese role extends beyond mere conception to active participation in an extra-linguistic discourse of sound. This perspective, I should like to think, underscores the interconnectedness of this composer, performer, and listener, both as individual units, but also as a single unit. And it reshapes traditional notions of their role within the cultural framework, like Waka. I try to illuminate the intricacies of these dynamics that create sound and create reception, emphasizing the collaborative nature of musical discourse and what I felt, or what I argued, was a profound implication for understanding cultural identities and the societal dynamics of pre-modern Japan.
Because, again, to follow up, I mean, the Shigen, as you were discussing earlier, and as Dr. Guest mentioned, I mean, is clearly performative with the intent of having an audience. Whereas the Waka that you're focusing on primarily, at least historically, is seen as as something that's written out. And so then that, because historically people working on it haven't thought about it being performed, right? Haven't thought about it being emoted. And that's really going back to my earlier question, this unique thread you're offering to this area of study. I would just offer out. I don't know if you agree or not, but that seems to be, from what I understand, both from the book and even the earlier study, is that what really makes your thread, your book, important in this larger question is this pulling apart the composer and the listener, and allowing the person who's writing to be all of those things at once, and then also to be thought of in terms of not just rhetoric, but rhetoric that has pitch sensitivity, as you've been mentioning. So, but again, I mean, it's a reconstruction. So, but at the same time, all language has, not all language, but most languages, and Japanese in particular, has pitch sensitivity that would create those sound relationships. I was just going to go into Kododama, actually, because I know that you and I discussed that a while back. If it's okay, unless I'm stepping on anyone else, could you talk about maybe any relation to that concept?
Right. So Kododama is a tricky little term, and I would like to think that what we've been discussing, this idea of how we embody sounds, or we kind of imbue sounds with, or imbue words with power, somehow relates to this idea of Kododama, but at the same time, the term kotodama, which, as I write in my book, really lacks a period theory of understanding and only shows up in a very small number of period sources. And it's one of those Japanese terms that tend to get taken up by Western emanating enthusiasts of Japan as some sort of descriptor for understanding the national character of a non-Western country. And I'm, of course, referring here to the Western practice of titling a book by taking some interesting Japanese word, adding the Japanese art or secret of, and along with whatever that art seemingly compromises, and churning out an international bestseller. For example, some of the recent ones were like Ikigai, the Japanese secret to a long and happy life, or Ganbatte, the Japanese art of always moving forward.
Right, right. But we should probably actually do a really quick definition of kotodama.
Yeah, so kotodama is essentially the spiritual power of words, the idea that a word doesn't come into being until it's actually spoken. And some sources, period sources, suggest not just spoken, but sung, recited. We see this idea of kotodama from everything to Japanese rituals to anime to manga. I mean, it's been taken up quite ferociously.
I think I would just add that I think one of the main distinctions is between, I mean, this idea of kotodama, and it was, of course, kind of resurrected by the nativists by the Kokugakusha in the Tokugawa period, and it was sort of used as a kind of ideological cudgel because the nativists were very kind of uncomfortable with despite the fact that they had all been trained, you know, by Neo-Confucianists. They were very, you know, they were their cultural agenda was to sort of create these distinctions between Sinitic culture and something like a very purely Japanese culture, right? And so that was one of the arguments that they made for, you know, kind of turn away from classical Chinese as a lingua franca and back to the Japanese language and what they felt to be were the, you know, the intrinsic spiritual powers and properties of Japanese words, right? In particular, not of Chinese words, but of Japanese words. So there's a whole lot of nationalistic baggage that attends to kotodama. There's a whole lot of, you know, and I think it's very distinct from ideas of musicality because it's really, it's about the word the word itself having, you know, just possessing that power, not anything to do so much with how the word is spoken, although obviously there could be better and worse ways of sort of, you know, articulating it in order to activate that power. But it seems to me you're doing something very different, that you know, you're looking at these things that we can, even though, I mean, they're lost to history, the performances are sort of lost to history. What you're more interested in is performance, right? It's not something that's imbued in the words themselves, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. Was that a question, or is it, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was just trying to because I felt maybe some people in the audience might not have had a clear sense of what kotodama signifies, and you know, I was just trying to sort of check my understanding of your argument in relation to you know, in relation to the question. But I'm also very interested. I mean, you know, you talk about the ways in which calligraphy can encode a certain, I don't know. It's not so much that you say that it's like notation, right? But how would you describe that, your sense of what the calligraphy is doing in terms of the musicality, right? I mean, how do those two things kind of interface? The ways that because you did talk a lot about how the calligraphy is kind of a record of its own making, right? You can tell how it was produced by the finished product. You can tell, you know, the speed at which the brush moved, the angles, the pressure, the degree of pressure that was, and so the calligraphy is a record of its own making. But at the same time, I'm wondering how the calligraphy then also can be not, you know, it can't be notation, right? It's not notation, but it does seem to contain within it a set of performance cues, perhaps. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, the idea of calligraphy being or not being notation wasn't anything that I invented. I think it was Bellitier back in the 1950s who wrote a book on Chinese calligraphy and somehow made it analogous to musical notation. I mean, I don't know, somehow I read it, I know. But it is possible to conceive of it as notation, but whether that's a historically accurate representation of how pre-modern Japanese thought of calligraphy, I probably wouldn't go as far to say that. But in terms of recreating sound for the purposes of understanding emotion, we can equate, say, how much pressure is applied to the brush in the sense of dynamics. We can say when the brush lifts off of the page, that's equivalent to a rest. When the calligraphy, the handwriting itself, kind of deviates from what might have been a standard way of writing a character at the time, we can say, okay, that may have had some significance for the calligrapher, especially when we're dealing with symbolic things like hototogisu, like the summer bird, or uguisu. Whether these characters connect or not is equivalent to slurs or phrases in music. So it's possible to treat it as notation, but I'm not sure I would go as far to say that the pre-modern Japanese treated it that way.
Actually,
okay.
Sorry. I was just going to say, Christopher and I went back and forth at one point about whether or not he should try and represent it musically in terms of like Western notation, because older studies had done that. And so part of that conversation basically came around to no, we're not doing that because that superimposes a Western musicality on top of a rhetorical structure based around, as he just said, the visuality of the paleography. So it was still, I mean, of course, if you look at the book, and please read the book, everyone, if you want to read the book, you'll see, of course, the visuality that Christopher has put together, but don't be looking for Western musical notes, because, well, as Christopher's been saying, that's not how it was performed.
To wrap that up before we go to the audience, I know that I think it's the time for that. There are scholars, especially French scholars, oddly, who have treated hiragana as musical notation, and in the sense that they represent the sound that's already in the composer's mind. And we mostly see that with something like no performance. But I can think of one person who would be able to contribute to this conversation really well, and that's Levan Harrison. I'm not sure if he's in the audience right now, but if he is, I would please speak up.
He is in the audience, and I would invite him to join the conversation because we're opening it up to the audience anyway at this point, as we noted. And for Professor Harrison, I guess you're going next, but if anyone else in the audience, if you have questions, please raise your virtual Zoom hand, and I will try to call on you in the order in which you raise your hand.
there's a lot to be said because I'm one of the, I think, one of the few people in here who does represent the Waka tradition, right? Who is a scholar of Waka. To begin with, I would say these questions of sound have been raised. My advisor, Steve Carter, was raising these questions in the conversations we had when I was at Stanford before he retired. And he raised the question that is a waka if it has never been recited? And what the textual record seems to point is it points to there is an orality about this poetry. And I mean, when you think about the word yomu, which is the word that we translate to compose and to read, whether you translate it using the character for to compose, or whether you translate it with the character to read, both of those are governed by the gomben, by the radical. So there is signs that already show there is an oral dimension to waka that we don't necessarily tap into because we are dealing with it from a textual base. And scholars like Steve have kind of recognized this, is that we are dealing with it in the textual when it's been written down, largely when it's been anthologized. So it's been gone from the kind of immediate production to kind of the editorial phase, and it may have been through multiple editorial phases if you think of Shinko Kinshu, right? Kind of the self-composition, the utawase, the actual kind of compilation of it into the final anthology. So it has been edited multiple times by the time we look at it as the written thing that is there, that becomes the printed thing that we see in the anthology. So there's a lot of complexity in the kind of sound written dynamic because there's a lot of people involved in this. So that was one thing that I wanted to say. Another thing that comes up is I can definitely put this out here. I'm the only person in here that kind of comes from the musical aspect, because I am a scholarly practitioner of gagaku, of court music. So yeah, when you drop Kigin, it automatically kind of made my hair stand up, because Kigin is one focused on largely Chinese couplets. And again, there's a lot that's involved in that, but I won't go onto that sidetrack. But coming from the Heian period, the interaction between gagaku and waka are there's so much interplay in that, and the sounds that are being kind of replicated in the moments that you're talking about with Saikaku and Kitamura is probably removed from what was going on in the Heian period, because again, so many of the this interaction between waka and gagaku, to the point that you have poets like Minamoto no Tsunenobu, Minamoto no Toshiori, Emperor Horikawa. His whole circle was a waka gagaku circle, and he had these poets who were equally adept at playing court music. And so that interplay is something that has to be, if you're talking about the connection between sound and poetry and music and all of these things, those things were already there in the Heian period. They were really interconnected. So the last thing that I would say is that the question of what is waka, I think, kind of goes to the term that I've always kind of been using for, which is practice. Waka is a practice because I think gagaku is a practice, calligraphy is a practice, and so what you have are these practices that are interacting. And when I say practice, I do not use it this kind of vaguely scholarly as it is. It has a very specific meaning to me. It's a meaning defined by Todd May in his book Our Practices Ourselves. And the definition of that is a practice is a regularity or regularities of behavior that are usually goal directed, that are socially normatively governed. To break that all down, regularities of behavior, the things that you do on a regular basis. Goal directedness means they are going towards some aim or some goal. Socially governed means there are roles that are to be played in the practice, and normatively governed means there are right and wrong ways of carrying out the actions in there. And so again, it really is something that involves, in my mind, a lot of interrelated things. And so you're right to kind of start to connect it, but my take on it is the web is far more complex. You're just starting one node of the web, and the web is far more complex and far more intricate. And so I'll leave it at that.
Isn't that what's so beautiful about Iwatsutsuji, though? Because it's pulling from the past and kind of this quantum superimposition of the present, at least the present for Kigin, and saying, hey, we're trying to invent this tradition, this literary tradition, or not invent. I mean, I guess you could say it invent. Shallow says invent, but it's more like standardize by looking at the past to inform the present.
But equally, that past was still there, because again, Garaku was still being performed in Edo and all of those things. So it raises the question of, is invention creating something new, right? And again, if you go back to the concept of practice to a Garaku performer, or even if we think in current time, you think of Shigin, nowadays there's Hiko. There is groups of Waka reciters. In Japan, Aoyagi Takashi, Kanichiku Nobuyuki, who I studied under, or have worked in his Kinkyushitsu in my dissertation. These kind of scholars are doing the kind of recitation of Waka, following the lines of the Ayano Koji, and there were lines of reciters that they kind of follow. So it then raises the question of, normativity, right? Is what's being done considered, it might be fine for them, but if there were existing forms of recitation, they're going to say, okay, no, that's not normative. We don't recognize that, or we find fault with that because it's not following the normative rules in our practice of Waka recitation.
I wonder how much room there is for improvisation, even within those normative guidelines. I mean, because you could still have, there might be still some margin for error there. I mean, I'm just thinking about how, I've had an interest in poetry for a long time, going to poetry readings and sort of listening to recordings as well. And there have been times when I've listened to recordings of poems read by the poets, right? So like a recording of Auden reading his own poems or what have you. And more than once, I've had the experience of hearing a poet reading their own poem and thinking, that's all wrong. You're not like, I don't like your interpretation of your own poem, right? So even though the poet is supposed to be the authority, there is still this room, right, for interpretation, even within, certain normative parameters.
Ever since Barthes, though, do we really care what the author thinks?
We don't have to, but we tend to instinctively, right? Sometimes. And if we're talking about this tradition where the reciters are not the poets, the calligraphers are often not the poets, right? So we have all of these groups that want a piece of this pie, but then they're kind of and then different performance traditions with their own normative standards, but there's obviously a lot of leeway there, it seems. I don't know, but
I would think, and Laurent can speak to this as well, that we would look at something like Jisei, and which was almost always improvised, at least shortly before death, for a tradition in which improvisation was paramount.
Daniela has a question.
Very much as an outsider. So if there is somebody here who is an expert who wants to come in and just hasn't gotten around to raising their hand, I would defer to them. But my question is precisely as an outsider, sort of zooming out a little bit. I would be very curious to hear, Christopher, you talk about what is at stake in redefining Waka from primarily something visual or poetic to something auditory or musical. And where I'm coming at this from, as you know, I work on early modern, colonial Latin America and early modern Europe, so very far from this. But a work by a musicologist that was incredibly helpful to me, and I think to the discipline, is Gary Tomlinson's work on Nawa song, where he took works that had been described since the 16th century as poetry, and said, no, not poetry, this is song. And why was it described as poetry? What was at stake in thinking of this as poetry, and showed how that had to do less with the quality of the Nawa traditions than with European evaluations of what is song, what is poetry, do these people have a literary tradition or not, and what work labeling something as poetry did in the 16th century, both for Nahuas and for Spaniards, and why revising that to song was sort of a reinterpretation that changed how we saw both the form and its interpretation at the time. And so, as someone who's very much outside of this field, can you explain to sort of the broader pre-modern or early modern world, what is at stake in redefining it musically?
That's a fantastic question. And I believe I close my book with a quote from Richard Minear, who says something like, perhaps it takes an outsider to point out the lines that were drawn so sharply in black and white are less dependable guides to understanding than previously has been so confidently assumed. And in my opinion, as an outsider coming to this, as we kind of opened and said, you know, musicology doesn't normally deal with Waka. It's a question of what we want the disciplinary study of Waka to be. And what the Western study of Waka should be, at least in my opinion, is far less important than what the Western understanding of Japanese culture should be, especially if we, as Gary Tomlinson says, silence, efface, or absorb this other, in this case, music or sound, as we try to understand whatever it is we're trying to understand. And for me, music, sound, especially as sound studies evolves into this idea of sound cultures, we're risking erasing an integral part of what makes up Japanese cultural identity. And I don't think that scholars are doing it. There are some scholars who are doing it intentionally, and those are the ones I kind of shoot a cannonball at in my book. But I think just because of the way tradition in the West has analyzed Waka, it leaves out the musical or the sonorous aspect. And if we don't say no music without Waka and no Waka without music, we risk that tradition just based on the trajectory of analysis, erasing an integral part of Japanese cultural identity.
Thank you so much, Christopher. I am very sorry to say that we are at time. So I want to thank very much our invited speakers today, Jennifer Guest, Stacey Jocoy, our moderator, Kerim Yasar, and thank you all very much for attending. Thank you to our co-organizers, the USC East Asian Studies Center and the USC Center for the Premodern World. And I want to very quickly remind anyone Here we have our last Levan book chat of the year, a week from today, when we will be discussing Tom Seyfried's Staging the Absolute Ritual in Russia's Modern Era. Above all, Christopher, many congratulations on your book, and thank you everyone.